Stuart Holman here, good to be with you again for this bonus daily devotional in our series on the book of Genesis. Yesterday we looked at the first half of the Joseph narrative where he ended up in Egypt. First of all, he was there as a slave, and then he was thrown into jail, a prisoner, but finally he became governor, second only to Pharaoh. Jacob, Israel, and his other 11 sons continue in the land of promise, deceiving and manipulating time and again, and although they seem unworthy of all that God has gifted to them there. But Joseph, however, seems to be a man of more noble character despite his experience of injustice. As we survey today Genesis chapters 42 to 50, we don't for a moment pretend that Joseph was perfect or that he was above a little bit of subterfuge and the orchestration of circumstances, but at least he was trusting that God would fulfill his word, that his brothers would one day bow down before him, that he would rule over them. With Joseph now in control in Egypt, the time comes when the famine in Canaan becomes so bad that the sons of Jacob, Israel, must travel to Egypt to buy some of the grain that Joseph has stored up over the previous 7 years of plenty. When his brothers arrive and they're recognised, we sense that this is Joseph's moment. After they had planned to kill him and then they sold him into slavery, here was a chance at payback for all that had happened to him. And without a doubt, Joseph makes them sweat, and he gives them a taste of injustice and imprisonment and fear. And then there's a little bit of to and fro and backward and forward between Joseph in Egypt and his father Israel in Canaan. But Joseph eventually reveals his true identity to his brothers, after, of course, they've all bowed down to him and proclaimed themselves to be his servants. At Joseph's invitation and with God's encouragement, Israel and his whole family relocate to Egypt, and they settle in there under the protection and really the beneficence of Pharaoh and, of course, his governor Joseph. And so the book of Genesis closes with this great family, the family of promise, the line of Abraham and Isaac and Israel, now being a large and powerful clan, not quite identifiable as a nation yet, but they're well on their way. So while there is much action and there's a lot of detail and many characters in this complex narrative, I want to draw our attention to the most important actor in the narrative, and that, of course, is God. Although the tables turn for Joseph and his brothers, there's all kinds of deception and manipulation, none of this is particularly important other than to note that it is God who is achieving his purposes through it all. At the crux of the narrative, as Joseph reveals his true identity to his shocked brothers, let's see what's in Joseph's mind. How does he understand everything that's happened? We're in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they'd done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." That's the big reveal. Imagine the shocked faces, the reality TV gaping mouths. But then the slow realization of his brothers that their lives are now in grave danger. If Joseph has a mind for payback or reprisals, what might happen to them? But Joseph takes us into his world, into his perspective. Verse 5, he says to his brothers, "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me here ahead of you." Now, who's behind all the action? Who is the one pulling the strings? It is God. And what was his purpose? To save lives, specifically the lives of the family, the covenant family of blessing, the offspring of Abraham, who are the beneficiaries of all that was promised. Land, nation, blessing. So for 2 years now there has been famine in the land, says Joseph, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Who does Joseph understand God to be? He is the great deliverer. He is the one who has placed Joseph in this outrageous position of governor over all of Egypt. He continues, "So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute.'" Now later again, when Joseph's brothers once again fear reprisals, Joseph sums it all up in chapter 50 when he says to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Notice the distinction that Joseph draws between the human will and the divine will. A human might plan something and carry it all out, thinking that they're achieving their goal. But it is God who determines the outcome. What Joseph's brothers intended for harm, God has intended for good, for the saving of many lives. And it reminds us, I think, of Herod and Pontius Pilate's plans and actions, possibly inspired, or definitely inspired by Satan himself. As they crucified Jesus, they planned this event for evil, and yet God used it for good, for the saving of many lives. Now, we might not plan evil for others. We're more likely to plan good for ourselves or for our family, at least I hope that's the case. But there is value in pausing to consider the outcome of our plans. Whatever we planned, what did God achieve through our efforts? At the conclusion of this little devotional, I'm going to encourage you to prayerfully consider what God might be doing, perhaps unnoticed, through your actions and efforts and the things that you've planned to do. Of course, we often need time. We often need the longer term perspective to fully grasp what God is up to. But perhaps God will reveal more of his ways to us as we give ourselves to this exercise. But there is one more brief observation, I think, to be made in these chapters. That even in this apparent diversion into the land of Egypt for the refugee family of Abraham, God is at work. His plan and purpose is developing even through the struggles of famine and displacement. We get to see this very clearly, and we see it through the eyes of the old man Israel, formerly Jacob. Remember, he's the one who has deceived and manipulated and strived and struggled to get the blessing of God. He is the one so passionately looking at God's promise of a people, of a land, and of a relationship. He's the one who surely was most uncomfortable about Joseph's invitation to relocate into Egypt and out of the promised land. Why would God's people leave this land that they had been promised? But old man Israel begins the journey, and when he gets to the southernmost border of the promised land, to Beersheba, he stops to offer sacrifice. And in Genesis chapter 46, we read this. When Jacob Israel reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father." He said, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." God is indeed advancing his purpose, because it is in Egypt that Israel's clan, a large family, will become a nation, in fact a great nation. Notice that God promises a return also to the land that he is leaving. I will bring you back again. So there is people and there is land, and well, what's the blessing? God promises that he himself will be with Israel. He will go down to Egypt with Israel and his family. Behind the plans and the purposes of human beings, God's greater purpose is being achieved. And so to the little exercise we flagged earlier, you take some time now prayerfully to ask God to reveal his working in some aspect of your life. When did you make a decision or plan an action only to find that things didn't turn out exactly as you planned? What might God have been doing instead, or perhaps through your actions? Is there something that God was doing in you or for you in this event? Maybe there's something God is doing right now through your actions, something above and beyond what you had planned. As you ponder that in prayer, make sure that you respond to whatever it is that God might show you. Next week, we will move on to the book of Exodus.